I never imagined that a simple conversation in our small, cluttered apartment could unravel the world my roommate had built around herself. Because for months, she had been blissfully unaware of the cracks beneath the surface of her relationship, swept up in the excitement, the charm, the attention of someone who, to her, seemed flawless. And I had watched silently at first, feeling a complicated mix of fear, frustration, and responsibility, because I knew truths she didn't, and I wasn't sure if revealing them would make me a hero or a villain in her eyes. And the night it finally happened started like any other, with her sprawled across the couch laughing at a story her boyfriend had texted, phone buzzing incessantly with notifications of his attention. And I tried to stay calm, rehearsing the words I had been turning over in my mind for days, because the truth I carried was heavy, shocking, and capable of destroying not just her perception of him, but also the sense of security she clung to. And as she laughed, completely unaware of the reality lurking beneath her romantic fantasy, my heart pounded with anticipation and dread, because telling her meant crossing a line, interfering in something deeply personal, and yet withholding the truth felt like complicity in her potential heartbreak. And I remembered every moment that led me to this decision, the hints I had picked up over weeks, the inconsistencies in his stories, the glimpses of anger or manipulation he had shown when I least expected it, the way he subtly controlled what she shared with friends and subtly isolated her from those who might notice the patterns. And as I rehearsed the conversation in my mind, I realized that what she needed was not confrontation without preparation, but a careful unveiling, a way to see the truth without feeling completely blindsided. And so I took a deep breath, trying to steady the nerves that made my hands tremble, and I began cautiously, framing my words as concern rather than accusation, gently guiding her attention to behaviors she might have overlooked, small incidents that, on their own, could seem trivial, but when placed together formed a pattern impossible to ignore. And at first, she laughed nervously, brushing it off, insisting I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into minor details, and I felt a pang of frustration, knowing that denial was natural, that protective instincts would make her resist the reality I was trying to reveal. But I pressed on, softly recounting instances that could not be rationalized, moments where he had lied, subtly manipulated her, or shown signs of selfishness masked as romance. And I watched as the laughter faded from her face, replaced by confusion, then doubt, then a creeping sense of betrayal, because the pieces I laid before her were undeniable, yet the truth is always difficult to accept when it comes from someone you love. And I saw her eyes widen, lips part, heart hammering visibly through the tension that filled the room as she processed that the charming, attentive boyfriend she had adored might not be the person she thought he was. And there was a moment of silence so thick it felt like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for her reaction. And in that pause, I realized how fragile trust is, how quickly admiration and love can be eroded when deception is revealed. And as she laughed, completely unaware of the reality lurking beneath her romantic fantasy, my heart pounded with anticipation and dread, because telling her meant crossing a line, interfering in something deeply personal, and yet withholding the truth felt like complicity in her potential heartbreak. And I remembered every moment that led me to this decision, the hints I had picked up over weeks, the inconsistencies in his stories, the glimpses of anger or manipulation he had shown when I least expected it, the way he subtly controlled what she shared with friends and subtly isolated her from those who might notice the patterns. And as I rehearsed the conversation in my mind, I realized that what she needed was not confrontation without preparation, but a careful unveiling, a way to see the truth without feeling completely blindsided. And so I took a deep breath, trying to steady the nerves that made my hands tremble, and I began cautiously, framing my words as concern rather than accusation, gently guiding her attention to behaviors she might have overlooked, small incidents that, on their own, could seem trivial, but when placed together formed a pattern impossible to ignore. And at first, she laughed nervously, brushing it off, insisting I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into minor details, and I felt a pang of frustration, knowing that denial was natural, that protective instincts would make her resist the reality I was trying to reveal. But I pressed on, softly recounting instances that could not be rationalized, moments where he had lied, subtly manipulated her, or shown signs of selfishness masked as romance. And I watched as the laughter faded from her face, replaced by confusion, then doubt, then a creeping sense of betrayal, because the pieces I laid before her were undeniable, yet the truth is always difficult to accept when it comes from someone you love. And I saw her eyes widen, lips part, heart hammering visibly through the tension that filled the room as she processed that the charming, attentive boyfriend she had adored might not be the person she thought he was. And there was a moment of silence so thick it felt like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for her reaction. And in that pause, I realized how fragile trust is, how quickly admiration and love can be eroded when deception is revealed. And as she laughed, completely unaware of the reality lurking beneath her romantic fantasy, my heart pounded with anticipation and dread, because telling her meant crossing a line, interfering in something deeply personal, and yet withholding the truth felt like complicity in her potential heartbreak. And I remembered every moment that led me to this decision, the hints I had picked up over weeks, the inconsistencies in his stories, the glimpses of anger or manipulation he had shown when I least expected it, the way he subtly controlled what she shared with friends and subtly isolated her from those who might notice the patterns. And as I rehearsed the conversation in my mind, I realized that what she needed was not confrontation without preparation, but a careful unveiling, a way to see the truth without feeling completely blindsided. And so I took a deep breath, trying to steady the nerves that made my hands tremble, and I began cautiously, framing my words as concern rather than accusation, gently guiding her attention to behaviors she might have overlooked, small incidents that, on their own, could seem trivial, but when placed together formed a pattern impossible to ignore. And at first, she laughed nervously, brushing it off, insisting I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into minor details, and I felt a pang of frustration, knowing that denial was natural, that protective instincts would make her resist the reality I was trying to reveal. But I pressed on, softly recounting instances that could not be rationalized, moments where he had lied, subtly manipulated her, or shown signs of selfishness masked as romance. And I watched as the laughter faded from her face, replaced by confusion, then doubt, then a creeping sense of betrayal, because the pieces I laid before her were undeniable, yet the truth is always difficult to accept when it comes from someone you love. And I saw her eyes widen, lips part, heart hammering visibly through the tension that filled the room as she processed that the charming, attentive boyfriend she had adored might not be the person she thought he was. And there was a moment of silence so thick it felt like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for her reaction. And in that pause, I realized how fragile trust is, how quickly admiration and love can be eroded when deception is revealed. And as she laughed, completely unaware of the reality lurking beneath her romantic fantasy, my heart pounded with anticipation and dread, because telling her meant crossing a line, interfering in something deeply personal, and yet withholding the truth felt like complicity in her potential heartbreak. And I remembered every moment that led me to this decision, the hints I had picked up over weeks, the inconsistencies in his stories, the glimpses of anger or manipulation he had shown when I least expected it, the way he subtly controlled what she shared with friends and subtly isolated her from those who might notice the patterns. And as I rehearsed the conversation in my mind, I realized that what she needed was not confrontation without preparation, but a careful unveiling, a way to see the truth without feeling completely blindsided. And so I took a deep breath, trying to steady the nerves that made my hands tremble, and I began cautiously, framing my words as concern rather than accusation, gently guiding her attention to behaviors she might have overlooked, small incidents that, on their own, could seem trivial, but when placed together formed a pattern impossible to ignore. And at first, she laughed nervously, brushing it off, insisting I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into minor details, and I felt a pang of frustration, knowing that denial was natural, that protective instincts would make her resist the reality I was trying to reveal. But I pressed on, softly recounting instances that could not be rationalized, moments where he had lied, subtly manipulated her, or shown signs of selfishness masked as romance. And I watched as the laughter faded from her face, replaced by confusion, then doubt, then a creeping sense of betrayal, because the pieces I laid before her were undeniable, yet the truth is always difficult to accept when it comes from someone you love. The next morning, the apartment felt heavier than usual, the air thick with the unspoken weight of the previous night, because my roommate's expression was no longer filled with casual cheer, but with a quiet, tentative apprehension, as if the revelation about her boyfriend had altered the very way she moved, spoke, and breathed. And I watched carefully, trying to gauge her state, aware that the emotional fallout from betrayal is unpredictable, oscillating between denial, anger, grief, and eventually acceptance. And as she moved around the small kitchen, making coffee with trembling hands, I noticed the subtle tremors in her voice when she spoke, the way her eyes darted toward the phone, hesitant to check messages that might remind her of the man she had trusted. And I understood that the process of integrating shocking truth into daily life is never linear, because every familiar object, every routine interaction could suddenly trigger memories, emotions, and questions. And as she took a seat at the table, hands wrapped tightly around the mug, I carefully began to guide the conversation, not to pressure or lecture, but to help her begin processing, to offer perspective, and to ensure that she did not feel entirely alone in navigating the emotional labyrinth that had opened up beneath her feet. Because the first night of revelation is only the start, the initial shockwave, but the following days are when the real reckoning begins. And I gently asked how she felt, allowing her space to respond, knowing that silence can be both protective and suffocating. And she hesitated, swallowing hard, eyes focused on the table, voice barely audible as she admitted confusion, disbelief, and a sense of betrayal so profound that it left her trembling. And in that moment, I realized how heavy the burden of knowing someone she trusted had been deceitful truly was. And I maintained a calm presence, offering empathy without imposing judgment, because part of processing betrayal is feeling safe to confront emotion honestly, without fear of dismissal or criticism. And as the minutes stretched into hours. The conversation moved slowly, haltingly, weaving through memories of incidents that once seemed trivial but now took on new significance. And I helped her connect the dots carefully, pointing out patterns in his behavior that she had rationalized or overlooked, not to manipulate her understanding, but to allow her to recognize reality through her own reasoning, because internalizing the truth requires both cognitive and emotional alignment. And as she began to voice her reflections, occasionally breaking into tears, occasionally pausing to catch her breath, I witnessed the first flickers of awareness, the moments when realization begins to settle in, painful yet necessary. And the process was exhausting, mentally and emotionally, because holding space for someone processing betrayal demands patience, empathy, and the capacity to manage your own reactions to their pain. Yet it was essential, because she needed to feel supported while confronting the dissonance between her perception of her boyfriend and the emerging truth. And as the day progressed, she oscillated between anger, grief, and disbelief, occasionally asking me to repeat what I had told her, or to provide concrete examples. And I did so with calm precision, recounting facts, messages, and subtle manipulations, avoiding emotional embellishment or subjective judgment, because clarity is crucial when someone's emotional world has been destabilized. And while she initially resisted seeing the full extent of deception, each moment of reflection brought more awareness, more questioning, and more recognition of the disparity between what she had imagined and the reality I had observed. And as we talked through the afternoon, I saw the beginnings of critical thinking emerge, the capacity to weigh evidence, analyze behavior, and begin to reclaim judgment clouded by emotional attachment. And in those moments, I understood that betrayal is not just an external event, but a process that requires rebuilding trust in one's own perception. Because when someone you love misleads you, doubt can seep into every thought, every assumption, and every decision. And guiding her through the initial stages of this reckoning required careful attention, structured support, and unwavering patience. And as the evening approached, the apartment grew quiet, except for the occasional clink of a mug or a sigh. And I watched as she began to write notes, record her thoughts, and articulate questions she wanted to confront. Because taking control of the narrative, externalizing thoughts, and actively engaging with reality is a crucial step toward empowerment and emotional recovery. And though moments of despair and tears persisted, there were also sparks of resilience, flickers of anger that indicated self-protective instincts reasserting themselves, and the capacity for critical reflection beginning to bloom. And in those moments, I felt a cautious sense of hope, because while the path forward would be difficult, uncertain, and emotionally taxing, the very act of facing reality, however painful, is a step toward reclaiming agency, rebuilding confidence, and developing discernment in relationships. And as night fell, and the apartment lights cast long shadows across the walls, I remained beside her, a silent witness and steady presence, understanding that recovery from betrayal is neither fast nor easy, but that through patience, empathy, and consistent support, she could begin the slow, painful, yet ultimately empowering process of reconciling the person she thought she knew with the truth she had discovered. And that in time, clarity, strength, and a renewed sense of trust in her own judgment would emerge from the initial chaos of heartbreak. Because while the boyfriend's deception had momentarily shattered her world, the process of confronting it, guided with care, would allow her to reclaim autonomy, rebuild self-confidence, and navigate future relationships with insight, awareness, and resilience. And as I watched her sip her coffee, eyes red but focused, notebook open, pen moving steadily across the page, I knew that this was only the beginning of a journey that would challenge, strengthen, and ultimately transform her. Because the truth, though painful, carries within it the power to liberate, and the way she responded now would set the foundation for a recovery rooted in clarity, courage, and self-determination. And as the hours passed in quiet reflection and conversation, I remained present, patient, and unwavering, because helping her confront the reality of betrayal was a responsibility I could not take lightly. And though the road ahead would be fraught with emotion, doubt, and grief, it was also a path toward empowerment, awareness, and the reclamation of her own voice, judgment, and agency. And in that understanding, I felt a deep, solemn recognition of the transformative power of truth, the necessity of support, and the delicate balance between empathy and guidance when revealing the harsh realities that lie behind someone's carefully curated perception of love. Over the next few days, the apartment became a fragile ecosystem of unspoken tension, punctuated by moments of grief, reflection, and slowly emerging determination. Because my roommate, once carefree and trusting, now navigated a landscape where every memory of her boyfriend was tainted with doubt. Every text, every call, every gesture she once cherished now examined through the lens of skepticism. And as I watched her move through this process, I realized the enormity of what it meant to witness someone process betrayal in real time. The way her body language shifted subtly, slumped shoulders, hesitant movements, gaze flickering toward her phone with a mixture of longing and fear, and I understood that the emotional recalibration required to reconcile affection with deception is exhausting, disorienting, and transformative. And so I maintained a careful balance of presence and space, allowing her to lead the pace of disclosure, reflection, and questioning, because forcing conclusions too quickly can overwhelm, while too little support leaves them isolated. And as we spent hours revisiting conversations, messages, and incidents, I noticed the way her critical thinking began to emerge, tentative at first, then firmer, as she began identifying patterns he had masked, inconsistencies he had rationalized, and subtle forms of manipulation she had initially dismissed as minor. And these realizations sparked waves of anger, heartbreak, and disbelief, alternating with moments of clarity and resolve, because the process of unpacking betrayal is rarely linear, and every new connection between past experiences and present awareness triggers emotional upheaval. And I found myself walking a careful line between validating her feelings and guiding her toward actionable understanding, because while emotional processing is crucial, empowerment comes from comprehension, boundary setting, and preparation for next steps. And as she began jotting notes, reflecting on past interactions, and questioning assumptions she had made about trust, love, and loyalty, I saw the emergence of a resilience that was both inspiring and fragile, because resilience in the face of deception requires strength, patience, and self-trust, and her ability to articulate what had been hidden beneath charm and attention marked the first stage of reclaiming agency. And yet moments of despair persisted, sudden flashes of grief, tears that erupted without warning, and bitter recognition of naivety. And each time I offered empathy without coddling, presence without intrusion, allowing her to inhabit the full spectrum of her emotional response. Because betrayal is not a singular event, but a process that unfolds across time, reshaping perceptions, values, and self-understanding. And as she revisited messages and interactions that had previously seemed trivial or positive, the cognitive dissonance became apparent. The very things that once created intimacy now revealed patterns of control, subtle manipulation, and deception. And I helped her navigate these realizations with care, drawing attention to patterns without assigning blame for prior naivety, because self-blame can be corrosive and counterproductive to healing. And as days passed, I noticed a change in her posture, expression, and speech, a slow but undeniable emergence of assertiveness, questioning, and self-reflection, because understanding betrayal requires integrating emotion with cognition, reconciling affection with evidence, and reclaiming autonomy in thought and action. And she began to articulate her feelings more clearly, expressing anger at being misled, grief at lost trust, and frustration at the discrepancy between perception and reality. Yet these emotions were no longer paralyzing, because she had begun to internalize the process of empowerment, recognizing that knowledge, reflection, and support provide the tools to navigate emotional upheaval and reclaim agency. And as we spoke about potential confrontations, boundaries, and future interactions, she began considering steps that prioritized self-protection, clarity, and emotional independence, demonstrating a remarkable capacity for strategic thought and emotional regulation in a context that had previously left her disoriented and vulnerable. And as I observed her developing discernment, confidence, and self-awareness, I felt both relief and awe, because witnessing the transition from shock to empowerment is rare, delicate, and profoundly transformative. And though moments of doubt, anger, and grief still surfaced unpredictably, she increasingly relied on reflection, evidence, and reasoned assessment rather than impulsive emotion or attachment. And the transformation was evident in her interactions with friends, family, and even the absent boyfriend, as she began setting boundaries, asking questions, and asserting expectations without hesitation or fear. And through these acts, she reclaimed a portion of herself that had been compromised by deception, because empowerment is an active process, a reclamation of voice, autonomy, and judgment. And as she journaled, debated scenarios aloud, and processed every encounter, I realized that betrayal, while painful, catalyzes growth, resilience, and self-understanding when met with support, reflection, and strategic insight. And I also saw how essential my role was, not as an interpreter of truth, but as a steady presence, a mirror, a guide through the emotional chaos, because the process of awakening to deception can feel isolating and destabilizing without consistent empathy, validation, and perspective. And as she began to articulate concrete questions for herself, prepare for conversations she might have with the boyfriend, and envision a future independent of his influence, I witnessed the gradual emergence of agency, clarity, and emotional fortitude, because understanding and confronting betrayal transforms not only perception of the other, but also trust in oneself. And in that transformation, there was both sorrow for what had been lost and exultation for what had been reclaimed, because the journey from shock to empowerment is both painful and profoundly enlightening. And as night fell over the apartment, with her notebook full of observations, questions, and reflections, I felt a deep sense of purpose in guiding her, supporting her, and witnessing the slow, deliberate emergence of clarity, strength, and the capacity to navigate relationships with awareness, discernment, and resilience. And in those moments, I understood that betrayal, while devastating, is also an opportunity for personal growth, insight, and the reclaiming of autonomy. Because the process of seeing deception, processing emotion, and rebuilding trust in one's own judgment is transformative. And by the end of this day, she had begun to take the first deliberate steps toward reclaiming her world from someone who had misled her, demonstrating the extraordinary resilience, intelligence, and self-awareness that betrayal can reveal when met with courage, support, and careful guidance. The following week was a mixture of emotional turbulence and cautious empowerment because my roommate, still reeling from the revelations about her boyfriend, began to navigate the delicate balance between heartbreak, anger, and the need for clarity, and I observed every nuance of her emotional processing, the trembling hands as she read past messages, the sudden flinch at familiar notifications, the pause before speaking when a memory surfaced that connected to deception, and I understood that betrayal does not merely shatter trust, but also distorts perception, creating an internal landscape where certainty and doubt clash violently. And as I guided her through these moments, I realized how essential patience, empathy, and careful framing are in helping someone reconstruct their understanding of relationships, because overwhelming them with truth too quickly can intensify fear and denial, while withholding support allows isolation and confusion to fester. And she oscillated between questioning herself, replaying incidents for clues, and slowly beginning to recognize patterns of manipulation, selfishness, and deception. And with every recognition, her emotional intensity surged, alternating between grief, anger, disbelief, and the tentative spark of resilience, because seeing the person you loved for who they truly are versus who you imagined them to be is both devastating and liberating. And as the days unfolded, she began documenting incidents, cross-referencing memories, and analyzing behaviors with a new lens, noting contradictions, omissions, and subtle coercive tactics. And I watched as the transformation from shock to awareness became evident, because reclaiming agency requires not only emotional processing, but also analytical reflection, understanding the mechanisms of deceit, and rebuilding trust in one's own judgment. And while moments of despair and tears were frequent, there was also a growing assertiveness, the capacity to question, challenge, and strategize. Because recognizing betrayal is only the first step. The next is learning to act with clarity, set boundaries, and make informed choices independent of manipulation. And in our conversations, she began articulating both immediate emotional responses and long-term considerations, weighing options for confrontation, disengagement, and personal protection. And I could see the gradual emergence of self-trust as she no longer relied solely on emotion, but combined it with observation and reasoning, because resilience is strengthened when emotional awareness is paired with rational analysis. And as the week progressed, she confronted small practical steps, deciding which communications to preserve, which questions to ask directly, and how to manage interactions without losing composure, because regaining control is not a singular act, but a series of deliberate, measured choices. And I guided her in framing these decisions, emphasizing self-preservation, clarity, and the importance of protecting her emotional and mental space. And through these exercises, I saw a marked change in posture, expression, and confidence, because the act of reclaiming agency manifests not only internally, but in the way one carries oneself in space, in conversations, and in interactions with the wider world. And while anger and grief still surged unpredictably, they were tempered by emerging strategies, support, and the recognition that understanding deception empowers rather than paralyzes. And she began to explore her boundaries, assert preferences, and define standards for future interactions, because part of overcoming betrayal is rebuilding the architecture of personal trust, self-respect, and judgment. And every decision she made, every observation she recorded, and every question she posed marked progress toward autonomy, clarity, and resilience. And I witnessed how betrayal, while painful, catalyzes profound self-awareness, because facing deception forces one to question assumptions, recognize manipulation, and cultivate critical discernment. And as we navigated the process together, I noticed that she increasingly relied on her own reasoning, less on external reassurance, yet still appreciated the presence of a supportive confidant, because recovery requires both internal empowerment and external validation. And as the week deepened into evenings filled with reflection, journaling, and quiet discussions, I observed the slow but unmistakable shift from passive shock to active processing, because she had begun to reclaim her narrative, assert her voice, and evaluate her relationship with knowledge rather than fantasy. And this transformation was both subtle and profound, expressed in the steadiness of her voice, the focus of her gaze, and the deliberate care in documenting and reflecting. Because empowerment emerges not only from awareness, but from deliberate, considered action. And by the end of the week, the apartment no longer felt solely like a space of shared living, but also a laboratory for processing betrayal, reconstructing judgment, and nurturing resilience. Because every conversation, reflection, and documentation effort contributed to a foundation of clarity, self-trust, and autonomy. And I realized that while the boyfriend's deception had initially shattered her perception, the process of confronting reality, supported by patience, empathy, and guidance, had begun to forge a stronger, wiser, and more resilient version of herself. herself, capable of navigating the complexities of relationships, trust, and personal boundaries, and that the pain of betrayal, while unavoidable, also carried the seed of empowerment, growth, and self-determination, because in learning to reconcile heartbreak with awareness, grief with strategy, and loss with reflection, she was building the tools to reclaim her life, restore confidence, and face the future with both clarity and strength. And as she closed her journal one evening, eyes red but resolute, I knew that the initial shock of revelation had passed, replaced by a nascent understanding of her own power, judgment, and capacity to navigate relationships with discernment. And in that moment, I felt the profound weight and responsibility of being a witness and guide, understanding that while I could not undo the betrayal, I could help her transform its aftermath into a foundation for clarity, resilience, and self-empowerment. Because the true measure of overcoming deception is not simply surviving it, but reclaiming agency, insight, and control over one's emotional and relational world, and she was already taking those first deliberate, transformative steps. As the days turned into weeks, the apartment's atmosphere shifted from one of stunned disbelief to a tentative rhythm of reflection, conversation, and emotional processing, because my roommate, once completely absorbed in the fantasy of her boyfriend's charm and attentions, was now engaged in the painstaking work of disentangling trust from deception, love from manipulation, and affection from control. And I observed every nuance of this transformation, the careful attention she gave to every message, the cautious assessment of past behaviors, the emotional flares of anger that quickly gave way to introspection, and the emerging capacity to analyze, question, and reflect without immediate overwhelm. And it became evident that reclaiming agency after betrayal is neither linear nor predictable, because trust, once broken, interacts with grief, doubt, and self-perception in a web of complex emotion. And as we spent long hours talking through incidents, behaviors, and inconsistencies, she began constructing a framework to make sense of the patterns, connecting small acts of manipulation, omission, or self-centered behavior into a coherent narrative that explained the dissonance between what she had imagined and what had occurred. And this recognition sparked waves of grief, frustration, and anger, yet also a sense of liberation, because understanding the truth is simultaneously painful and freeing. And I noticed the subtle shift in her demeanor, the tension in her shoulders easing, the hesitancy in her voice replaced with cautious clarity, the tentative reassertion of boundaries in interactions with friends and family, and the deliberate reframing of her relationship with the boyfriend from unquestioned trust to critical assessment. Because reclaiming control requires both reflection and action, and she began to assert herself more confidently, asking questions, challenging inconsistencies, and articulating expectations that were previously ignored or rationalized away. And as I guided her through the process, I emphasized the importance of pacing, emotional grounding, and self-protection, because confronting deception while emotionally raw can exacerbate trauma if not approached carefully. And through this guidance, she developed strategies for engagement, reflection, and decision-making, balancing emotional processing with rational assessment. And gradually, the apartment became a space not only for living, but also for active recovery, critical thought, and self-empowerment, because every conversation, reflection, and journaling session contributed to a foundation of awareness, judgment, and resilience. And as the days progressed, I witnessed her growing ability to navigate reminders of betrayal without immediate emotional collapse, because she was learning to integrate knowledge, observation, and critical reasoning into her emotional responses. And as she began exploring potential next steps regarding communication, boundaries, and personal well-being, it was evident that she was reclaiming authority over her life, because empowerment is not granted by others. It is built through deliberate action, reflection, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. And the transformation was evident in her interactions with friends, family, and even in the moments she considered contacting the boyfriend, because she now approached these situations with discernment, clarity, and a prioritization of self-preservation rather than emotional reactivity. And although grief, anger, and doubt continued to surface intermittently, they were no longer paralyzing, because she had begun to internalize resilience, critical thinking, and a capacity to set boundaries as tools to navigate relationships safely. And I saw how betrayal, while initially shattering, can catalyze profound self-awareness, agency, and emotional intelligence when met with support, reflection, and deliberate action. Because processing deception requires both understanding the manipulator and reaffirming trust in oneself. And as we worked together to chart incidents, analyze behaviors, and anticipate potential interactions, she increasingly relied on her own judgment while valuing guidance, demonstrating the emergence of a strong, self-aware perspective. Because empowerment emerges when one learns to trust evidence, intuition, and reason over emotional attachment and wishful thinking. And as the weeks unfolded, she became more deliberate, reflective, and confident in assessing her feelings, articulating needs, and planning next steps. And I watched with a mix of awe, relief, and pride as the transformation became tangible, expressed in her posture, voice, and decision-making. Because the journey from shock to awareness, grief to empowerment is arduous, yet the deliberate cultivation of resilience, discernment, and autonomy allows someone to emerge from betrayal not just intact, but stronger, wiser, and more capable of navigating relationships, trust, and selfhood. And by the end of this period, it was clear that while the pain of deception would linger, its power to destabilize had diminished, replaced by clarity, agency, and a renewed sense of judgment, because she had begun to reclaim her narrative, set boundaries, and assert her needs with confidence. And as I observed her journaling, planning, and reflecting with purpose, I understood that this process, while slow and emotionally demanding, was laying the foundation for lasting resilience, self-trust, and the ability to engage with relationships in the future from a position of awareness and empowerment. And in witnessing her transformation, I recognized the profound responsibility, challenge, and privilege inherent in supporting someone through betrayal. Because while I could not undo the deception, I could help her transform its aftermath into a path of clarity, strength, and self-determination. And through every conversation, reflection, and shared silence, she demonstrated the power of deliberate, supported engagement with truth, and the extraordinary capacity of a human being to reclaim agency, reconstruct perception, and emerge from betrayal with insight, resilience, and control over her own emotional and relational life. Because the journey through shock, grief, and anger ultimately leads to empowerment, discernment, and the profound understanding that the truth, though painful, carries within it the potential for liberation, self-respect, and the capacity to navigate future relationships with confidence, awareness, and strength. And by the end of this period, it was clear that while the pain of deception would linger, its power to destabilize had diminished, replaced by clarity, agency, and a renewed sense of judgment, because she had begun to reclaim her narrative, set boundaries, and assert her needs with confidence. And as I observed her journaling, planning, and reflecting with purpose, I understood that this process, while slow and emotionally demanding, was laying the foundation for lasting resilience, self-trust, and the ability to engage with relationships in the future from a position of awareness and empowerment. And in witnessing her transformation, I recognized the profound responsibility, challenge, and privilege inherent in supporting someone through betrayal. Because while I could not undo the deception, I could help her transform its aftermath into a path of clarity, strength, and self-determination. And through every conversation, reflection, and shared silence, she demonstrated the power of deliberate, supported engagement with truth, and the extraordinary capacity of a human being to reclaim agency, reconstruct perception, and emerge from betrayal with insight, resilience, and control over her own emotional and relational life. Because the journey through shock, grief, and anger ultimately leads to empowerment, discernment, and the profound understanding that the truth, though painful, carries within it the potential for liberation, self-respect, and the capacity to navigate future relationships with confidence, awareness, and strength. And by the end of this period, it was clear that while the pain of deception would linger, its power to destabilize had diminished, replaced by clarity, agency, and a renewed sense of judgment, because she had begun to reclaim her narrative, set boundaries, and assert her needs with confidence. And as I observed her journaling, planning, and reflecting with purpose, I understood that this process, while slow and emotionally demanding, was laying the foundation for lasting resilience, self-trust, and the ability to engage with relationships in the future from a position of awareness and empowerment. And in witnessing her transformation, I recognized the profound responsibility, challenge, and privilege inherent in supporting someone through betrayal. Because while I could not undo the deception, I could help her transform its aftermath into a path of clarity, strength, and self-determination. And through every conversation, reflection, and shared silence, she demonstrated the power of deliberate, supported engagement with truth, and the extraordinary capacity of a human being to reclaim agency, reconstruct perception, and emerge from betrayal with insight, resilience, and control over her own emotional and relational life. Because the journey through shock, grief, and anger ultimately leads to empowerment, discernment, and the profound understanding that the truth, though painful, carries within it the potential for liberation, self-respect, and the capacity to navigate future relationships with confidence, awareness, and strength. And by the end of this period, it was clear that while the pain of deception would linger, its power to destabilize had... I could feel the tension building again, even as things in the apartment seemed to settle into a new rhythm, because healing from betrayal is not a straight line, and every quiet night still carried questions, memories, and unresolved emotions. And although she appeared stronger and more aware each day, there were still moments when the past seemed to demand attention, knocking at the door of the present, requiring confrontation rather than avoidance. And this became even clearer when one evening she stood frozen in the hallway, staring at her phone as though it were a bomb about to detonate, and I immediately sensed something had shifted, something that would push her forward into the part of her recovery where truth must finally collide with action. And when I approached her cautiously, she turned the screen toward me, revealing his name lighting up the display with a message that read, "We need to talk." And I watched the swirl of emotions in her eyes: fear, anger, nostalgia, curiosity, and the overwhelming desire for closure, which warred against logic, boundaries, and self-preservation. And with her hands trembling slightly, she opened the message, revealing a long block of text filled with familiar, manipulative tactics, apologies that focused more on his discomfort than hers, declarations of love that sounded like ownership rather than devotion, excuses disguised as explanations, and subtle implications that she had misunderstood everything, all wrapped in a plea to meet in person just one last time. And the moment she finished reading, she exhaled shakily, a tight mixture of disbelief and recognition crossing her face, because his message perfectly illustrated the dynamic we had spent weeks unpacking, his ability to twist responsibility, invalidate her emotions, and center himself in every narrative. And the look she gave me wasn't a plea for direction, but a confirmation of what she had already begun to understand, that he didn't miss her, he missed control. And with that clarity emerging, she finally asked the question she had been circling around for days: should I meet him? And I knew my response carried weight, because while I had been guiding her toward empowerment, this was a decision that would define her boundaries and future coping patterns. So I told her gently that meeting him wasn't inherently wrong, but the purpose mattered. If she sought closure and walked in with strength and clarity, it could help her reclaim her narrative. But if she went in emotionally vulnerable or hoping for validation from him, she might find herself dragged back into the cycle of self-doubt and manipulation we had worked so hard to break. And she nodded slowly, taking in every word with a seriousness that showed how much she valued her own progress. And after a long silence, she typed a simple reply: "Okay, we can talk," establishing the meeting for the next afternoon at a cafe only a few blocks away, a public place where safety and boundaries could be maintained. And afterwards, she set the phone down and pressed her palms against the countertop, grounding herself in the physical world, because the emotional surge from that exchange was powerful enough to shake her foundations if she wasn't careful. And I reminded her to focus not on what he might say, but on what she already knew, to hold on to the truths she had fought to uncover, and to remember that this meeting wasn't about him, it was about her reclaiming control. And she took those words in like armor, preparing for the emotional battle ahead. And although a part of me wanted to go with her, be a silent guard in the background, I knew this was something she needed to face on her own to fully step into her newfound strength. And that night was restless, not with fear, but with anticipation, like the air before a storm, charged and heavy with the promise of change. And as she paced and rehearsed what she wanted to say, her voice no longer shook from anxiety, but from the weight of truth she was ready to deliver. And I assured her that no matter how the conversation went, she was already winning simply by standing up and choosing herself over the illusion he once offered. And when morning sunlight streamed into the apartment, she was already dressed, not in anything meant to impress him, but in an outfit that made her feel grounded, comfortable, confident, like she was fully in her own skin again. And as she stood by the door with her bag slung over her shoulder, she took one deep breath, met my eyes with a nod that said everything words couldn't, and stepped out into the hallway to face what once controlled her, but could no longer define her. And as soon as the door shut behind her, I felt the apartment fall into a tense, expectant silence, the kind that makes every sound sharper and every minute longer. Because even though I trusted her strength, I also understood the emotional landmines waiting for her at that cafe, and I sat there imagining different scenarios: him crying, him denying everything, him playing the victim, him trying to touch her hand like he used to, hoping nostalgia would soften her resolve. Yet deep within me, I knew that while he once held power over her emotions, that power had been dismantled piece by her growing clarity, and she now approached the meeting not as someone seeking approval, but as someone standing firm in truth. And meanwhile, she walked the familiar streets with a strange sense of calm pulsing beneath a layer of nerves, because she could feel the shift inside herself, a strength she once believed belonged only to others, now fully inhabiting her body and mind as she approached the cafe entrance, spotting him instantly through the window, sitting with exaggerated posture, as though he wanted to appear composed and confident. But the moment she walked in, he straightened abruptly, trying to read her expression, searching for any remaining softness he could exploit. And she approached the table without hesitation, sliding into the seat across from him and greeting him with a level tone that held no invitation for intimacy. And he seemed taken aback by her calmness, because he had expected tears, trembling, or at least the softness of nostalgia. But what he found instead was a woman who had seen him clearly for the first time and refused to look away. And his first words were as calculated as ever: "You look different," meant to unsettle her, to make her question her own evolution. But she only nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a fact rather than accepting a compliment. And she waited, giving him space to reveal his motives. And as expected, he launched into a speech filled with self-centered regret, describing how the breakup had hurt him deeply, how he felt like he lost a part of himself, and how he believed that if she could just understand his side, everything could be repaired. And she listened without interruption, taking in every word without allowing his emotional theatrics to distort her clarity. And when he finished, he looked at her with hopeful expectancy, as though his performance should have been enough to erase everything he put her through. But she didn't break, didn't fold, didn't offer him the emotional relief he wanted. Instead, she took a slow breath and told him in a steady voice that she didn't come to hear excuses or rekindle anything, but to return his lies to him and walk away free. And his expression cracked slightly, confusion flickering into irritation as he realized his usual tactics were failing. And he tried again, pushing blame toward others, toward circumstances, hinting that she had been too sensitive, that she had misread things, that maybe her friends, including me, had influenced her unfairly. But the more he spoke, the clearer his manipulation became, because not once did he acknowledge the pain he caused without twisting it into an inconvenience for himself. And slowly her calm shifted into quiet strength as she corrected every gaslit claim with evidence, examples, and the truth he could no longer distort, until his frustration spilled through the cracks of his charm, and he snapped, accusing her of ruining everything, of overreacting, of being selfish, desperate to regain any shred of dominance. Yet even his anger couldn't shake her, because she finally saw the reality. This wasn't love he was fighting for, it was control. And with that final realization anchoring her resolve, she stood, placed a small folded note on the table, not for him, but for herself, a symbolic act of closure, and said, "I'm done letting you dictate how I feel about myself," before turning toward the exit, leaving him speechless, shocked, and visibly scrambling for a response that would keep her there. But she didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't flinch at the sound of her name leaving his lips, because the moment she pushed open the cafe door, her chest expanded with the first full breath of freedom she had taken in months, and each step away from him felt like reclaiming pieces of herself he had stolen. And when she returned to the apartment, the moment the door closed behind her, she leaned back against it with a long exhale that carried both exhaustion and triumph, her shoulders slowly relaxing as though a weight she had carried for far too long had finally been set down. And as I watched her expression shift from tension to relief, to quiet disbelief, she finally said, "I did it!" Not proudly, not dramatically, but with the soft awe of someone realizing they just broke free from something they once believed they could never escape. And I hugged her tightly, feeling her heartbeat steady against me as the adrenaline drained from her system. And when she eventually pulled away, she walked further into the apartment with a steadiness in her step that hadn't been there before, as if every inch of the floor she crossed reaffirmed her independence and authority over herself. And she began talking then, recounting every detail of the meeting, how he tried to use guilt, how he tried anger, how he tried charm, how every tactic he once used so successfully had fallen flat against the shield of truth she had built within herself. And the more she spoke, the more vivid it became that this was not just closure, but transformation, because she wasn't trembling through the retelling or doubting whether she had been too harsh or too impulsive. She was analyzing his behavior with clarity and distance, calling out manipulation in real time, acknowledging how each sentence he delivered had been crafted to serve his narrative rather than acknowledge her pain. And as she processed the dynamic with such self-possession, I felt a deep surge of pride, not in myself for supporting her, but in her for reclaiming everything he tried to erode, her judgment, her emotional intelligence, her ability to know what she deserves. And that night, instead of replaying the pain, she celebrated her courage, not wildly or with forced enthusiasm, but quietly, with soft music playing from her phone, a warm drink in her hand, and a journal open as she wrote not about him, but about who she was becoming without him. And as hours passed, she began to laugh again, not the nervous, brittle laugh she had when she was suppressing discomfort, but the full, genuine kind that comes from the chest and softens a person's whole face. And seeing that made me realize that while healing isn't complete in a single moment, sometimes there is a turning point so profound that everything afterward feels different, lighter, possible. And over the next few days, she deleted old photos, cleared out screenshots of messages she once analyzed for hidden meaning, threw away trinkets he gave her that were now nothing but reminders of exploitation disguised as affection. And she did it all without hesitation, almost with relief, as though every discarded item returned a fragment of herself to her own possession. And as the environment around her transformed, so did her daily habits. She reached out to friends she had slowly withdrawn from, she returned to hobbies she once abandoned because he didn't approve, she applied for new opportunities with excitement rather than fear of how he might react, and she spoke with a new tone when describing her future, not tentative, not hypothetical, but certain, grounded, ambitious, because now she saw herself not as someone needing to be chosen, but someone already whole, deserving of reciprocity, respect, and real love. And I realized then that trust, once destroyed, doesn't just grow back the same, it grows back wiser, stronger, more discerning. And one evening, while we sat on the balcony watching city lights flicker beneath a quiet sky, she said, "I don't think I ever understood what love really was." And instead of sounding broken, she sounded enlightened, because she now recognized that what she had endured was not love, but control, wearing a convincing disguise. And she promised herself softly but firmly that she would never again let someone make her feel small in order to feel significant themselves, because she now understood that the right person is someone who protects your joy, not someone who feeds on your insecurity. And though the scars of betrayal will never fully disappear, she was learning to carry them not as proof of weakness, but as evidence of survival and a awakening, and it struck me then how incredible it is when a person refuses to let someone else be the author of their worth and chooses instead to write their own definition of who they are and what they deserve. And in that moment, as she closed her eyes and breathed in the cool night air like a declaration of freedom, I knew she would never again allow him or anyone like him back into the sacred space of her self-worth. And over the following weeks, that promise she made to herself manifested in tangible and meaningful ways as she rebuilt connections she had once neglected, rediscovered passions that long laid dormant, and allowed herself to enjoy life without the constant pressure of someone else's expectations looming over her. And even though moments of vulnerability still visited her from time to time, late nights when memories crept in or unexpected reminders triggered old feelings, she learned not to interpret those moments as setbacks, but as natural parts of a healing process she was now fully equipped to navigate. And during this period of growth, she also began to reflect on the role I played in everything, not with dependence or guilt, but with gratitude and mutual respect, acknowledging that while I helped her recognize the truth, she was the one who did the hardest work, confronting the lies, facing the pain, breaking free from the cycle, and choosing herself over the comfort of familiarity. And one evening, she sat with me at the kitchen table, her expression thoughtful, and she told me that before all this, she didn't truly understand the value of support that comes from a place of genuine care rather than expectation or control. And she said she finally recognized the difference between someone who wants to possess you and someone who wants to see you thrive. And those words resonated deeply with me, because in helping her, I had also confronted things within myself, memories of times when I had accepted less than I deserved, moments when I allowed someone's insecurities to dictate the measure of my worth, times when I ignored red flags because the idea of being wanted felt more comforting than the truth of being manipulated. And through her journey, I was reminded that emotional exploitation is not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's quiet, disguised as affection, disguised as attention, disguised as love. And seeing her reclaim her life helped me see, with fresh clarity, all the ways I too had once allowed someone else to puncture my self-confidence with subtle control masked as concern. And for the first time in a long while, I began to examine my own boundaries, my own history of allowing charm to overshadow character. And in doing so, I found myself evolving alongside her. And what began as me supporting her healing soon became a shared transformation, each of us learning and unlearning together, building a foundation of emotional discernment and mutual empowerment that made our apartment feel like a sanctuary rather than a place haunted by the ghost of a toxic relationship. And as we continued to move forward, we noticed that the hold he once had over her narrative was fading rapidly, replaced by the sound of her laughter, the confidence in her decisions, the peace in her quiet moments, and the way she now carried herself with unshakable belief that she deserved honesty, respect, and joy without compromise. And one night, she looked out the window, eyes reflecting the city lights with new clarity, and she said, "I think I'm finally free." And I believed her, not because she said the words, but because every part of her life now aligned with them, her choices, her boundaries, her mindset, her future. And in that moment, I realized the truth. Sometimes the worst heartbreak becomes the catalyst for the most powerful rebirth.